The 7 factors of awakening are one of the ways that the Buddha gave us to understand how far we were along the path and to keep an eye on whether we were directed towards awakening in our practice. Now, I haven't discussed these factors in the past. I haven't done a video on the 7 factors of awakening yet. And one of the reasons is that I've found it somewhat confusing, these 7 factors. There are different ways to understand them. And so in this video, I'll try to tease out some of the different ways to understand these 7 factors and try to make it a little bit more understandable for all of you. I'm Doug Smith from the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you click the bell down below, you'll receive notifications when I come out with new videos. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into elements of the Dharma of early Buddhism, which is what I discuss here, check out onlinedharma.org and the courses that I have over there. So the 7 factors of awakening. These are really a very important part of early Buddhist teaching. In fact, they appear at the end of the very famous sutta on mindfulness. So mindfulness practice that we do nowadays comes from, the practice comes from an early sutta, an early teaching of the Buddha. And at the end of that teaching, it talks about mindfulness of these factors of awakening. That is to say, our ability to be aware of when they are arising and when they haven't yet arisen. And I did an earlier video on some of the history of mindfulness, which I'll put up on the screen here in case you want to see that at the end. If you click on it, it'll still be there, I believe, until the end of the video, so you can click on it at any time if you just hover your mouse on the upper right corner, I believe. Anyway, it's the corner at one of these corners right here. So I can't think backwards when I'm anyway. So the point is that it was indeed, it seems to have been part of the original mindfulness sutta as far as we can tell these things. So a bunch of other material was added to the sutta on mindfulness, material that wasn't there originally, but these 7 factors of awakening, this seems to have been the way that the Buddha basically ended that sutta, so far as we can tell. So it's very important on those grounds. Also, these 7 factors of awakening appear in the sutta on mindfulness of breathing, which is a different sutta in the early tradition that also informs our contemporary mindfulness practice and meditation practice. It's also an extremely important and influential sutta, and these 7 factors of awakening appear in that sutta many different times. They appear in different respects, so that we are supposed to sort of understand these in different aspects of how they manifest themselves in our mindfulness practice and in our awareness of where we are on the path. So even there, they're important. And if we look in general at these 7 factors of awakening, which I'll get to enumerating in a minute, if we look at them all, they seem to lead us, generally speaking, from the direction of mindfulness practice to the direction of concentration practice. And we're going to get into a lot of that coming up. Now, these factors of awakening are typically contrasted with the 5 hindrances. That is to say, they are an example of having overcome the hindrances. Now, hindrances, you may not be familiar with that word. The 5 hindrances, I did an earlier video. I'll also put a link to that up on the screen in case you want to hear about them in more detail. But basically speaking, they are 5 sort of states of mind that make meditation more difficult, or that make meditation less successful for us. So for example, a mind of ill will is one of the hindrances. If we're too caught up in anger and hatred, that's going to make a meditation difficult. If we're too caught up in looking for sense pleasures, that'll also make meditation difficult. If we are too sleepy, that's going to make meditation difficult. If our mind is too scattered or too filled with worries and concerns, that also, I think many of us will know, makes meditation difficult. And finally, if we're having doubts about our practice, that also hinders our meditation. So these 5 hindrances are the things that we're supposed to be overcoming in order to get to a place in meditation that is most useful to us. And as we overcome these hindrances, we find that the factors of awakening come more to the front because they become more apparent as we overcome these hindrances. So then what are the 7 factors of awakening? I'll get to those in just a second, but first I do want to take at least a couple seconds, I would love to do that, to tell you a bit about Patreon, because Patreon is the way that I try to support this channel and keep it third-party advertising free. Patreon is a way that you can help support the channel, and in return, you can gain certain minor little benefits, such as, for example, if you want to receive an audio version of these lectures of mine, of these videos, so that you can listen to them while you're out jogging or while you're commuting in a car or on a train. That's one option. I also allow you to gain early access to these videos so you can see them in advance of other people. And if you also want to receive show notes, detailed show notes, the ones that I use to give these videos with the sort of notation of all the things that I discuss, that's also available over on Patreon. Now, there are show notes below every one of my videos, but they are basically, it's a small paragraph, it's a summary of what I'm going to be discussing, but it's not the full show notes. If you want to get the full ones, that's available over on Patreon. And there are other things as well. I suggest taking a look if you're interested. So what are these 7 factors of awakening? Well, to say them quickly and clearly, they are, to begin with, mindfulness, then what's called investigation of states, then either joy or rapture, depending on how we translate that term, then energy. After energy, we have tranquility, and then concentration, and then equanimity. Those are the 7. Now, there are many different ways of interpreting and understanding each of these 7, or all of them in a group. And to my knowledge, in the early texts, they're not really well described. In other words, there's not really a very full description of each of these understood in the context of the 7 factors of awakening. So, to a large extent, we have to come with our own interpretations, and there are at least a couple of different ones that I can think of, which I will get into. But my expectation is probably that these were not perhaps so well described in the early texts because they were meant to be somewhat multivalent. That is to say, they were supposed to have different meanings depending on where you were on the path. And you might interpret them one way if you were at a certain place on the path, and perhaps you might interpret them a different way if you were farther along the path. So, and this is true of many of the different concepts in early Buddhism, such as the Eightfold Path or the Noble Truths, where there are different ways of understanding them, which correspond to different sort of levels of understanding or different places you are along the path of practice. And so we don't necessarily need to expect that there's going to be a single way. What I'll do here then is to point out 2 different ways that I can see of interpreting and understanding these 7 factors of awakening. And I think I give both of them because I think both of them are valid. One of them I think is a more everyday kind of understanding of how they might be interpreted, where they all refer to sort of ordinary states of consciousness, more normal kind of understanding of how we would use them on the path, and indeed the way that normally people would tend to discuss them nowadays. And then after that, I'll get to a different way of interpreting them, where they seem to point to altered states of consciousness, where they seem to point to deep meditative states of certain kinds. And these will probably be less useful nowadays to us, at least to many of us, although I think probably originally the second way would have probably been the way that might have been intended, and I'll also get into a little bit of that. So in any event, let's start with the first, which is the more ordinary, everyday kind of interpretation of these 7 factors of awakening. And indeed, probably this is the way you might have heard of them or might hear of them if you were to listen to a contemporary Dharma teacher talking about these. So it begins with mindfulness. Here we start the factors of awakening by practicing mindfulness meditation. So mindfulness meditation is the beginning. It's where we start. It's the first factor of awakening. If we're practicing mindfulness meditation well, we're already revealing or undergoing or experiencing one of these factors of awakening. That is, perhaps we're aware of the present moment. We're sitting in awareness of what's going on around us right now, without judgment. We're simply aware of what's coming and going. That is the beginning. Now, the second one of these factors of awakening is investigation of states. Now, what does that mean? Well, we can think of it, if we're sitting in mindfulness meditation, that certain kinds of states arise and pass, and perhaps as we sit there for long periods of time, we become curious. And this curiosity arises within us, and we start investigating. Just sort of, if you like, in a sort of a passive way, or only sort of not very active, but in a sort of a passive way, investigating what's going on around us. Or perhaps even after we've come out of meditation, we think back on our meditation, how things seem to pass. In particular, we might try to investigate how it is that certain states of the world affect us, affect our minds, and how states of our own mind in response affect the world. So for example, we may experience arguments during our daily life. We may get into an argument, let's say with somebody on the internet or a friend or family member, and we notice in meditation how that affects our state of mind. And we can see how the anger, perhaps, that was fomented, that originated in that argument, persists with us and taints our meditative state and makes our mind less pliable and less pleasant over long periods of time. And so we can come to see these kinds of causal connections and become aware over time of the way that these connections can be either beneficial or not beneficial to us, can be harmful to us. And so that's investigation of states, where we're investigating the role of causes and conditions in our own mind and in the way our mind then affects the world. Now, this second goes to the third, which is energy. Well, energy is arisen or arises. We can think of this like there's the case from ancient Greece, the philosopher, I've forgotten which one it is, who was trying to figure out how to discover the volume of an irregular solid, as I recall, something to this effect, and so sat in his bath. And as he sat in the bath, he realized that the bath water would rise up to the extent of his own volume, so that he could therefore use that technique, this technique of figuring out the water displacement to discover the volume of solids. And what did he do? He said, "Eureka!" And he got up out of the bath and apparently ran naked through the streets of Athens or something like that. Well, that's the energy we're talking about. And perhaps it's not going to be quite so energetic for you, but nevertheless a sense of eureka, of having discovered something. Not just having heard it from somebody else, read it in a book somewhere, that's not so exciting, but to have understood, to have seen it in your own experience during meditation, during mindfulness, to have investigated these in your own life and seen the ways that they happen. Well, that can be a real source of energy. Then the energy that arises within us may give us the impetus to make changes in our lives, to make changes in how we interact with the world. It can give us this impetus to keep going. In fact, to begin again, if you like. And as we make these changes in our lives, and with success perhaps, with some modest success even, then joy arises as we see the successes perpetuating down the months and years. Joy arises within us. As I say, there are different ways of interpreting, translating the word. The Pali word here, I believe, is piti. Piti can be interpreted as joy. It also often is translated as rapture, which rapture is, I think, too strong a term in this context. But in any event, it gives us joy. And this kind of joy then basically helps to lessen our tendency towards worries and concerns, the kinds of mental states that are part of the five hindrances, that these mental states that hinder our ability to calm down. So this joy then creates in us tranquility. It helps to create tranquility within us by lessening our worries, our concerns, our stress, if you like. And this mental tranquility then allows us to become more concentrated. And concentration then sort of clarifies more of reality for us. As we're less concentrated, we're less able to really delve into the nature of our own experience, really. As we are less concentrated, we're more liable to be distracted. In fact, that means the same thing, basically. Distractions tend to make our mind less able to see the way things really are. And as our emotional ferment tends to die down, we get, as I say, we get this kind of concentrated mind. We're able to see things more clearly. Then it is said in these 7 factors of awakening, over time, more of a sense of equanimity arises. That is, we're less pulled this way and that by the worldly winds. We're more able to see our experience, to see what is in front of us without favoritism, without trying to grasp towards certain things and push other things away, but simply to see things as they are, as coming and going. And so, as a result, we're getting closer to non-attachment, which is the general goal here. I did an earlier video on non-attachment, which I'll put up here on the screen. And this goal of non-attachment is really, in many ways, can be seen as essentially another way of saying awakening. That as we become more non-attached to elements of the world, as we become less identified with parts of the world, we become happier, we become more complete, we have less dukkha, less of a sense of unsatisfactoriness, and hence we're going towards awakening. Now this is a long path. It's very easy to say it in 7 steps, but in fact these are going to be very, very long-term kinds of practices. But we can see here in a way that these can build upon themselves in ordinary kinds of mind states, ordinary kinds of consciousness, in a kind of a normal practice. However, as I say, there's another way to understand these 7 factors of awakening, which is perhaps a little deeper in one sense. It seems to be perhaps more early, an earlier way of understanding it, going back perhaps to early Buddhism. But let's go through them again from this other perspective. So the perspective here is that these 7 factors of awakening are leading us on towards what's called jhana. And jhanic meditation are deep states of absorptive meditation, where we meditate for long periods of time, and over these long periods of time, the mind really does quiet down, and what we find in these quiet states of mind is that there arise feelings of joy from within us. They seem to arise from nowhere, and indeed if we try to force them, they won't arise. So these things seem to arise naturally when we become very, very calm. And there are a series of 4 of these jhanic states, that is to say, deeper and deeper states, more and more pleasurable or pleasant states of mental absorption, of deep mental concentration. But this begins, even in the early descriptions of how we get to jhana, the descriptions begin with our entering mindfulness meditation. That is to say, when an early description is given of how you reach jhana, it begins by sitting down and becoming mindful and entering into a mindful state. And so that is part of how we begin to calm ourselves, because mindfulness meditation in general begins with meditating on the breath, which is a good calming meditation, an awareness, open awareness of what's going on around us. The mind begins to calm down because we're less worried about the past and the future. We're simply focused on the present. Then it's said that as we become more mindful and calm, we can notice, we see that the hindrances have been overcome. So these 5 hindrances to good meditation, to mindfulness, or indeed to concentration meditation, we see that they've been overcome. And that is an example of investigation of states, this second one of these factors of awakening. Now, in this interpretation, the third part of this, these 7 factors is energy. And energy does not explicitly occur within a description of trying to achieve jhana. However, we can understand that by having an awareness of the fading away of the hindrances, that this will give us confidence, a kind of energetic confidence to continue along the path. This gives us the impetus to continue. This seeing of the past, this understanding and interpreting of the passing of the away of the hindrances, gives us a kind of energy to continue. And then it's said that joy arises. Now, as I discussed in the my last interpretation here, another way of translating the word is rapture. And I think rapture is something that makes more sense as an interpretation in this context, because the feeling that one gets in the first jhana is a feeling of really sort of bubbling kind of joy and happiness. It's a very active kind of feeling. And some people who go into jhana will even sort of shake a little bit, sort of vibrate a little bit because of the feeling that arises within them. And this is just sort of a natural kind of occurrence if you allow it to arise on its own. It's not something you can force, again. So this sense of joy or rapture is indeed one of the characteristic feeling tones of the first jhana and the second jhana. The difference between the first and second is really one of intensity, where the first one is more intense with this kind of joy and rapture, and in the second jhana, the joy and rapture the rapture becomes somewhat lessened, because it's a very active kind of, again, energetic kind of state, and as a result, by being energetic, it isn't quite as tranquil as some of the later jhanas. So we can see the move the progression of the 4 jhanas is from, if you like, from energy towards tranquility. So it begins with this sort of energetic feeling of rapture. Then it's said that the rapture brings tranquility as we progress to the second and third jhana. And then tranquility itself produces concentration. In fact, as we move from the first to the second jhana, our mental activities, it's said, die away, so that we cease having any awareness of mental activity as we get to the second jhana. We certainly cease having, it's understood, cease having any kind of mental discussion, mental chatter, if you like, because we're simply completely absorbed in the feeling that's involved, in the kind of feeling in our body and mind. And then from tranquility to concentration, then from concentration, it's said, to equanimity. And equanimity, which is the 7th of these factors of awakening, equanimity is a hallmark of the 3rd and the 4th jhana. And in particular, the 4th jhana, where really it's just a sense of all-pervading equanimity. So equanimity is really the hallmark of the 4th and final and sort of deepest jhanic state. And so we can see here how these 7 factors of awakening map almost exactly onto a progress from mindfulness to concentration, or perhaps differently said, from mindfulness to jhana, to the 4th jhana eventually. And now one of the reasons that I say that this second way of interpreting these 7 factors of awakening seems to me the earlier one is that it explains in a very, I think, deep way how it is that the 7th factor of the Eightfold Path moves to the 8th factor of the Eightfold Path. If we know the Eightfold Path, which is perhaps the most famous discussion of the path in Buddhism, the 7th factor is right mindfulness, and the 8th and final one is right concentration, which is understood in early Buddhism as jhana in particular. And it's always, I think, been something of a question mark for many of us why it ends with jhana or concentration. It seems like nowadays we would put it the reverse, where you begin with the concentration, you get yourself concentrated, and then you move to mindfulness. Well, not so in the early texts. In the early texts, it really seems to go from mindfulness to concentration. And if we look at the 7 factors of awakening, we can see that progress in detail. how it is meant to be shown, how it is meant that we're to move directly from mindfulness, which is the first factor, into investigation, joy or rapture, and becoming more concentrated, and finally into equanimity, which are, again, stages of jhana. I think it would be really useful to go back for a refresher on the Eightfold Path. I have an earlier video on the Eightfold Path, which I'll put up on a link here on the screen. I'd recommend checking that out so you can put it into this context that I've just given you right here. I hope this has been useful. I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you, I hope, will be well.